Good morning. We'd like to welcome you to this session, and we are just honored to have as our speaker Professor Patricia Hill Collins. I was okay? Yes. Okay, Professor Hill Collins is the Distinguished University Professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. So I'm just going to read a few of the many works that she has done, which is why you're here. You've read some, if not all of them. She is a social theorist whose research and scholarship have examined issues of race, gender, social class, sexuality, and/or nation. Her first book, Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment, was published in 1990. And it has a revised 10th year anniversary edition that was published in 2000. It won the Jesse Bernard Award of the American Sociological Association for significant scholarship in gender, and the C. Wright Mills Award of the Society for the Study of Social Problems. Her second book, Race, Class, and Gender, an Anthology, 8th edition, 2013, and edited with Margaret Anderson, is widely used in undergraduate classrooms in over 200 colleges and universities. Black Sexual Politics, African Americans, Gender, and the New Racism received the American Sociological Association's 2007 Distinguished Publication Award. Her other books include Fighting Words, Black Women and the Search for Justice, From Black Power to Hip-Hop, Racism, Nationalism, and Feminism, Another Kind of Public Education, Race, Schools, and Media, and Democratic Possibilities, The Handbook of Race and Ethnic Studies, edited with John Solomos, and On Intellectual Activism. She has published many articles in professional journals, and she is just famous. Okay? I'm not... But she isn't famous just because she's famous. She's famous because of the incredible scholarship that she has done, the deep intellectual thought that is, undeniable, and the ways in which she takes both the personal and makes them into something that a wide variety of people might be able to engage in. So I'm not going to prolong this, as I've said it, but I said it Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot's talk. You are not here to see me again. You're here to see Patricia Hill Collins. Let us welcome her. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and for that wonderful invitation. Can everybody hear me? Because we are fortunately not like yesterday with that masses of people, I can be more conversational. So that's what I want to do this morning. I'm going to be talking with you about some ideas because I think we're at a very important historic moment. 9 years ago, I was writing a book called Another Kind of Public Education, Race, Schools, the Media, and Democratic Possibilities. And I was writing it during a period of time of immense change. We were wondering whether there was going to be the possibility of an African American president, whether he would get the nomination. What would that be? Could that possibly happen? I was also president of the American Sociological Association at that point. 2 years out, planning a major meeting without knowing what society was going to look like, and thinking about issues of race, schooling, democratic possibilities in the media, while all of it was swirling around me. And at that time, I put forth an argument without knowing how things were going to turn out. For example, the 2008 financial collapse in terms of global capitalism and what happened in the world and how we've been dealing with the aftermath of that. I look back on that period, a period of possibility and a period of immense change from today, which is also a period where we don't know what's coming, but we know what is behind us. And there have been some significant issues around democracy and how it looks from today. Significant changes around race, even though people seem to think that racism is gone. Well, we know now it is not gone. The media is certainly a different climate I was writing in the middle of some significant shifts from what I would call corporate media pressing down on us and the emergence of something called people's media as a site of democratic participation. So what I'd like to do today is to talk about those ideas and to start with, let me just think here now. Let me just catch up to myself. Occasionally I get ahead of myself. All right. Oh, I borrowed a clicker from Joe. Thank you very much. Raise your hand. He's lending me his clicker, and it's the fanciest one I've ever had. So I'm trying to get adjusted to this fancy clicker here, but I'm sort of liking it a lot. All right. This is the overview of my presentation. I'll be talking about three main ideas. The first main idea is fighting for participatory democracy. Very often we know what we're fighting against, but we don't necessarily think about the significance of why we're doing it, the big picture. What we lose if we do not fight for participatory democracy, a certain kind of democracy. I will then move on to talk about the continuing challenge of racism, how things look now versus how they have looked in the recent past. I will finish by talking about critical thinking and media literacy as an important site of public education or educating the public. But I'm going to start by reading. And I'd like to read you a story, Fighting for Participatory Democracy, that comes from my book. This is a graphic of my high school. Now, I'm fortunate enough to have attended a high school, the Philadelphia High School for Girls, that is still standing. As you know, many schools are no longer there, or they have gone through so many changes. This is an urban public institution, you should know that. This is not a private school. And if you know anything about Philadelphia, it's changed dramatically. Well, I want to take you in the Wayback Machine when I was in high school. And quite frankly, it is a serious Wayback Machine at this point, all right? So you can imagine, just imagine no gray. Imagine me doing all kinds of things like that, as opposed to how I had to stagger up here in the convention center and all of that. But I opened this book with a vignette, and I want to open this with the vignette because I think it talks about the significance of each of us learning to think for ourselves and the difficulty of doing so and the necessity of doing so in a participatory democracy. And this is called, What Does the Flag Mean to You? By the time I began my senior year at the Philadelphia High School for Girls, my public school education had almost silenced me. The days of playing the lead in my preschool pageant or chattering away with my elementary school friends were distant memories, all but erased by my school district's tracking policies that left me marooned in overwhelmingly white settings. I rarely spoke in any of my classes. As a working-class African-American girl, I knew my place in a school that catered to middle-class white girls. I could stay if I didn't make waves. So I sat and I listened. Given my chronic silence, I was surprised when my 12th grade English teacher asked me whether I'd be willing to deliver the Flag Day speech at Independence Hall. What an honor! To sit on the dais erected at the site of the Liberty Bell and the Declaration of Independence, and to participate in a ceremony held at the birthplace of American democracy. I had no doubt about my ability to write a speech or to deliver it. All I had to do was answer one simple question. What did the flag mean to me? Well, I thought writing the speech would be easy. Yet when I got home, crafting it turned out to be far more difficult than I'd expected. When it came to issues of the American flag and its black American citizens, growing up in my African American neighborhood had apparently raised more issues than I anticipated. What did the flag mean to my father? I wondered. Despite serving in a racially segregated army, his service in World War II did leave him a proud veteran with a strong commitment to the flag. Risking his life to defend the flag did not shield him from racial discrimination at home. Despite his status as a veteran, banks refused to grant him the low-interest loans that routinely were offered to white veterans, which would have enabled my family to buy a house in the burgeoning suburbs of Philadelphia. What did the flag mean to my mother? She rarely mentioned anything that had to do with politics. By the time I was in high school, she had given up her dream of attending college and becoming an English teacher. Her secretarial job at the Department of Defense helped pay the bills, yet she was never recommended for promotion. Instead, as I discovered years later, she spent years training her bosses, all of them white men who routinely started out as her subordinates. Year after year, she simply got up, went to her job, reading a book on the subway as respite from and reminder of her unceasing work and her dream deferred. So what could the flag mean to me in this context? I was doing all that I could to be ready if and when the doors of opportunity that had been closed to my parents opened to me. I got good grades, was a church organist, little known secret, I actually was one. A Sunday school teacher, I was actually a Sunday school teacher. I know, restrain yourselves out there. Played the trumpet in my high school band and orchestra. Yes, I played the trumpet in my high school band and orchestra. And I even made all my clothes. I was on the path to success. Yet I was also plagued by the growing recognition that the American ideal of meritocracy was a myth. How was it, I asked, that the flag could signify the lofty ideals of democracy suggested by my public school education? Yet my parents and others like them struggled so hard to improve their lives, with many, like my mother, never achieving their dreams. Why was I having such difficulty writing this simple flag talk? I wondered. Despite my misgivings, I wrote what I thought was a muted, respectful speech that expressed my true feelings. My speech was no knee-jerk tribute to Old Glory. Instead, it aimed to breathe life into the principles that the flag seemingly represented. My speech stated my commitment to the democratic ideals that the flag engendered. In particular, fairness, equal opportunity, and justice for all. Yet it also tentatively questioned the contradictions that surrounded the flag. Unlike now, when I speak of racism so openly, I said nothing about race in that talk, but I remember that race was on my mind. I took my speech to my English teacher and waited anxiously while she read it. After a few minutes, she calmly remarked, "Patricia, we need to make a few changes." Out came the red pen. When she was done, she said, "I've made a few minor changes. Please look over them, and once you make them, your speech will be fine." When I got home, I reviewed her comments. I had expected her to correct my grammar, yet I was stunned to see that with the strokes of her red pen, my teacher had completely changed the meaning of my entire speech. Gone was my ambivalence about the meaning of the flag, and by implication, the meaning of democracy. The speech that she expected me to give was an uncritical celebration of American patriotism. Now, when she invited me, I sensed that I was selected to give the speech because I was African American. By that time in my educational career, I also understood that you had to be careful what you said in school, because none of my teachers really cared what I thought. If I said what I really thought, it might be dangerous for me. Now, this speech incident stands out for me as one of the first times that I took a stab at saying what I thought, albeit in a muted, tentative fashion. But this speech was also the first time that I became painfully aware that I was selected because I was perceived as being a particular kind of black person. I faced a dilemma. So what should I do? Ooh. I don't think I'll tell you yet. Click! Because I've had the opportunity to revisit, I went to my, are you ready for this, people? I have to hold myself up because it does shock me when I hear myself say this. 50th high school reunion in the same building where I was a high school student. And my colleagues came in, we were girls the last time I saw many of us. We were not girls at this reunion, all right? We assembled in the library. We were all excited. The school was full of black and Latino students, very few white students in the school. When I attended, it was full of Jewish students, first-generation children of people who had migrated from Europe, black and some Latino Puerto Rican students and white students, other white students. The school was the same building, same library. But when the principal said, now I'd like to tell you about the school, we had questions. Where's the band? Where's the orchestra? Where's the choir? Where's the library? What's happening in the library? And she told us, no band, no orchestra. All right, no librarian. Problems in the science lab. No money to get something fixed in the gym. I confronted firsthand this old story, which is the story of the promise of democratic possibilities and how one might actually move forward, and the reality of what I would call privatization and the defunding of public institutions. So here we are. So my story is both it's clearly a sociological story, an economic story, a political story, all of that, when those of us who are involved in research and we understand the patterns. I don't feel the need to parse it all out for this particular group. But I want you to understand what's being lost and potentially gained by continuing the struggle for these institutions, both within them and outside. So, just to remind you, devaluing the public, what's at stake? I want to talk about fighting for democracy and democratic possibilities. Neoliberalism, many of us are aware of, and the challenges of privatization. For those who are not necessarily, you're in the trenches and you're thinking, I don't have time to sit around and think about neoliberalism, my God, all right? When I wrote this book 10 years ago, the word neoliberalism is not in there. But privatization is. Because I was working with my growing suspicion that something was changing around me in my everyday life. My own institution was changing. My teaching career is profoundly different now than when it started 30 years ago. So neoliberalism argues market-based solutions to social problems. That's how you solve problems. Let the market do it. Restricting markets aggravates and or causes social problems. So if you let markets be free, then social problems will go away. I don't quite know how that works with poverty and a variety of things like that, but I'm kind of telling you the going rhetoric. Too much government regulation is the problem. Is this sounding familiar? Because government regulation is regulating the markets that are going to solve these social problems and bring prosperity to all. And privatization provides cost savings, efficiency, and better products. Now, of course, if you think people are products, then that's something else. Now, I would ask the question, in what ways are privatization and democracy compatible? Because in many ways they can be compatible, but in many ways they are not. What we have seen since I wrote this book is the devaluation of public transit. There's a road around Washington, D.C. where you actually pay. You've seen these lanes where you pay to drive in a certain lane of the highway in terms of the private funding of what used to be public infrastructure. Public health is clearly under assault, and that's battled there. Quasi-public prisons. The notion that the prisons appear to be state institutions, but so much of what's going on there is privatization. And if you link that to issues of mass incarceration of black and Latino folk and low-income white people very much, you realize that mass incarceration is very much bundled together with privatization and neoliberalism. It's not just an ideological thing of we don't like black people. It's a very different type of argument. And of course, for this particular venue, K through 12 schooling and higher education, particularly public higher education. Now, higher education has for some time had the grace to take a step back and say, oh, what's happening in K through 12 schools like my high school, oh, that's too bad. I'm so glad I'm not those teachers. But what we're realizing is that this particular rhetoric, this particular ideology about privatization is now much more prominent. That's what I didn't see 10 years ago. I just saw it as, we'll always have democracy and we must chat about privatization. And now I don't see it that way. I actually see that this is really a dig in one's heels moment. Let me pick up the pace or I'll never finish. Oh gosh, this is me. On the front line. So I would make an argument, which I'm not going to make ad nauseum here because I think this conference has many, many people who are arguing similar things. But I think we are at a moment where we have an ongoing tension between education as a public good and education as a private commodity. And that plays itself out in a lot of ways. But I will argue that educating the public is essential for democratic participation. If education becomes a private commodity, we impoverish the public because it doesn't have the skills that are needed to participate in democracy. We lose democracy, right? Teachers, parents, students, and their allies, they're not just marginalized off in the corner in this. I see these groups as frontline political actors in fighting for democracy. So I am much less interested in what the politicians have to say about, yes, democracy is good and blah, 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 than in what happens with teachers, parents, schools, and their allies, you see, because that's the future. Okay, this is a really big chart. And I'm going to leave this up here for this is the biggest and most text-intensive chart of this entire PowerPoint. So do you want to read, or do you want me to just kind of keep going, come back to it? Because basically what I'm arguing here is that there's a line in the sand. I would raise this as a question. There is education for assimilation into the status quo. That was my teacher saying to me, you have to say what I want you to say if you want to be successful, Patricia. And if you don't say what I want you to say, you will be punished, as in you don't get that opportunity. Now, to cut through all of the many words that are out there about this, to me it is very much about assimilation. Now, it's not that the status quo is inherently evil, but I think the process of just telling you, you must submit, and that's the vision of education, is a very modest horizon for democracy and certainly for education. So this left side, schooling that uncritically reproduces, upholds, and or defends existing social institutions. It's the uncritical nature of reproduction that I have issue with, not the fact that some things are very much worth keeping and cherishing and reproducing, but others are not. It's the uncritical. So I'm saying mindless patriotism and to me leads to shrinking democratic possibilities, that knee-jerk old glory thing. Technical skills for employment, why would we not want people to get technical skills to get jobs? This is a good thing. Let us all say yay around that. That's a point of agreement. But innovation, imagination, and our critical thinking skills, for what purpose? You know, everybody wants to have this full learner who does, for what purpose? That's why I'm asking this question about participatory democracy and democratic participation. To me, elitism is excellence, really is part of this whole model, that you know you're excellent because you beat out all the other people and you're really elite. And there must be another way of defining excellence that is inclusionary. And market-based solutions to social problems would be the going rhetoric. Let's just bring out that market-based solution and we'll solve that problem in our school and our whatever. But education for democratic possibilities is more expansive. It can actually accommodate education for assimilation because it's bigger. Right? So I'm encouraging us to think bigger, because then we create democratic possibilities. Schooling that critiques, challenges, dismantles, and or rebuilds existing social institutions. It's not all about putting up walls and preserving what is good or what one purports to be good, but it's also imagining new ways of being good. All right? Critiquing and building existing social institutions. Democracy under construction. Democracy is not done. It's not a thing. You can't put it in a box and mail it to somebody, or you certainly can't go to war and tell people, we've brought it to you. You know, be grateful. It's always under construction, and it requires participation. And it requires people with technical skills who are employed. I believe in being employed. Yay. Go employment, all right? Imagination, innovation, and critical thinking skills are for you, but they're also for the social good. They can be put to use for the social good. Recognizing the strengths of a heterogeneous public and collective problem solving and community-based solutions to social problems. So I put this chart up here to put in sort of stark relief just two very different ways of viewing the world. And I'm arguing that in many ways we have to put these in dialogue with one another. But I really think for democratic possibilities, we cannot just go down the road of assimilation into the status quo. That, to me, is just it's a no-go. But I don't know what this other one looks like. And this is the whole point of having an educated public and saying we have to do things for the public good. Okay. So, another kind of public education requires building vibrant, inclusive public institutions. You get good at being a public by practicing. You practice participation in democracy, and that's how you get good at it, and that's how it gets better. But if you shut out all these people so they never get a chance to practice, things can go very differently. Part 2 and Part 3 of what I'm going to talk about are these next two themes. Another kind of public education requires understanding how social inequalities undermine participatory democracy. It's not like you can have a participatory democracy in a multicultural society like ours and just ignore inequality. Like it has nothing to do with democracy. It has nothing to do with it. Can't do it. So in the book in another kind of public education, the book, I took on the challenge of racism. And I think I'm going to take on the challenge of racism again today. Even though much of my work very much looks at the world through an intersectional lens of race, class, gender, sexuality, I'm not going to go that route quite yet. Because I think what happens in some work on intersectionality is people think that if they're mentioning the word race, they have in fact dealt with race. That intersectionality is about race and class because we mentioned it. And what we have to do is go back and pull out each of those concepts and look at the literature and the historical advocacy around those terms. And just start talking more honestly about that. And then we get a better intersectionality that certainly would be great for democratic participation. So I'm going to take on the stinky issue. You know, it's like, oh, no, again, we have to race. Oh, why? But I won't dwell on it, all right? I'll just bring it up until you go, no more, and then I'll move on to part 3. All right. Another kind of public education requires recognizing multiple sites where education for democratic participation occurs. We have to break this notion that education is just schooling or education is just formal. That's important. I'm not saying that. But to think about how people educate one another in really creative ways. And I would like to look at, for that, critical thinking and media literacy. Because I think the media and what's happening there is very, very interesting. So I want to spend some time on that. Everybody okay? Part 2. Well, you had to just tell me that even if you weren't. That was the right answer. Yay. You've been to school, haven't you? The continuing challenge of racism. Well, this is I just want to say, I'm going to be talking about post-raciality. And post-raciality is this idea that we conquered racism. The society is colorblind. And one of the ways you know that we conquered it is because we have a black president, or we had a black president. So there was much celebration when Barack Obama won the election. And the Obamas have had to be very careful about their public image. The part of their public image they control looks like this. We've got Barack and Michelle and the 2 girls, and everybody's smiling, and they're all dressed really well, and they've got great teeth. Look at these people. They have wonderful teeth, all right? You know, they are married. There is no baby mama up in here. There is no, nothing. I mean, the whole thing, they're heterosexual to the best of our knowledge. It's all, you could not have cast a better Hollywood couple, family, to be the first black family in the White House, all right? Now, even with that, I can't imagine anybody being any better than these folk. Even with that, looking at the last 8 years and saying, oh my gosh, some of them don't even believe he was born in America. They don't even realize Hawaii is part of America. This is amazing. This is amazing to me. You can just say any old thing, all right? So it was very difficult period. The continuing challenge of racism is to really come to terms with what's happened. What have we learned from the last 8 years, all right, under this situation? So I'm going to put this up quickly, post-raciality. A belief in the social ideal of a colorblind society. Nobody's going to argue with the fact that we should have a meritocracy and it should be based on talent and energy. But unfortunately, being colorblind for many people, they feel it seemingly eliminates racism because they think of racism as just individual prejudice and discrimination. And they say things like, well, I like Patricia Hill Collins. I'm not prejudiced against her. I wouldn't discriminate against her, so I'm not racist, kind of thing. Well, it's not the point. Completely wrong question. All right? Rather than looking at personal inside of me, sort of in the heart of me, I think we have to look at social institutions, right? Hi, Rod. How are you? You just getting here. Where have you been? I'm sorry, this is a former student of mine. And this should give you an idea how it goes. Okay, sorry, I was distracted. All right, a belief in the social ideal of a colorblind society, and the notion that being colorblind seemingly eliminates racism. But post-raciality does not mean post-racism, because we've gotten lazy. We talk about race as a substitute for racism. And into that word race, we can just pour all kinds of things that can be anything. It can be my individual racial identity. It could be race as a socially constructed concept that's not real. So we have a lot of people running around saying, if I use the word race, therefore I've created race. And it's not, so I'm going to make sure it doesn't get real because I'm not going to talk about it. Very bizarre. All right, if you think about it that way. All right. Now, of course, if you have the first black family in the White House, that's what you're supposed to be saying, because you don't want to undermine this benchmark of racial progress. So post-raciality does not mean post-racism. What it does is it creates a dual problem. You get the visibility of race in a multicultural democracy. Come on. All the people that say, I don't see race, I just think they're deluded. You know, I mean, I just think that's got to be one of the oddest things anybody says. But, you know, we all been walking around and pretending, I don't see it either. Me? I've never seen it. I used to see it until last week, and now I don't see it anymore. You know, you just get these. I travel a lot, and honestly, I hear a lot of things, and I'm just trying to just keep it all in. All right. But the problem, I think, for scholars is this, and for politicians and sort of leaders, is the lack of language to analyze contemporary racism. So in many ways, we have been asleep at the wheel, under the, you know, sort of lulled by the waves of post-raciality and arguing about, yes, there is a colorblind racism. Yes, it's colorblind. While we haven't paid attention to the fact that color-conscious racism never went away. They exist together, but we haven't had the space to have that discussion until now. In that space, white supremacy, and I'm using the word white supremacy, which I don't use often, but I feel it's really important to start being much more specific historically. I think has created a vacuum in anti-racist, white supremacy, has been able to flourish in the context of this vacuum in anti-racist discourse. So white nationalism and the alt-white are coded language for white racism and white supremacy. And while I've been busily writing books about colorblind racism that have been aimed at humanizing people who want to be humanized, or people who want to just learn about race, and they have biracial children and all that kind of thing, wonderful thing to do. What we've had is another group on the right that has basically said, we have a very different agenda, and we're not just crackpots. We're not just a few strange people off in the corner. We're actually a fairly sizable force, particularly if we know how to marshal the public. If we know how to educate the public to different values, ironically, to claim that we're democratic. All right, because we're making things more inclusive. So here we have the National Policy Institute, just so you know. This is the Southern Poverty Law Center, which gives us lots of information on them. The National Policy Institute is, quote, an extreme right-wing group, they call them this, quote, close quote, whose core belief is, quote, white identity is under attack by multicultural forces using political correctness and social justice to undermine white people and their civilization. Now, you're not going to get a clearer statement than that. That's why I put it up here. Because if I were to talk in euphemisms, and I would say, oh, white supremacy is way out there someplace, you know, the bad white people, all of that. No, I think we really need to have names. We need to study this for real now. But maybe there's some incentive to study it now. A turning point, the 2016 presidential campaign and its aftermath. If you follow the campaign and also the aftermath, and this is the whole notion of the connection between hate speech and actions, right? So when there is going to be a more public embrace of hate speech, we also see actions individual and, unfortunately, increasingly policy actions that target different groups. And this is where intersectionality becomes really interesting. Because if we were to identify the differently targeted groups, you can't just say racism is one big thing writ large, some kind of common principles. I think what we need to do is look at the specific histories of groups that are differently targeted, and they're all racialized, but they're racialized differently, and ask what have been those stories. Interestingly, when you do that, you end up with the foundation for an intersectional argument that's quite different than what I would call the La La Land version. I actually saw that movie and liked it, but I shouldn't use it that way because it's, it was kind of fun, all right? It wasn't Moonlight, but it was fun, all right? Latinos, Latinas, Muslims, black people, LGBTQ people, women, disabled people, indigenous people, immigrant populations, and anti-racist white people, by the way, of which there are quite a few, are differently targeted because of who they are, how they behave, what their beliefs are. And I think for many of these groups, it was a shock. I mean, really what's been going on lately has been a shock. They really believe, keep my head down, assimilate, it's going to work out for me. All right. If I tell the right flag story, it's going to work out for me. I'll just write their flag story. Don't see me. You don't see me, right? You don't see Muslim. You don't see. All right. And that just doesn't happen. That's not happening right now. So we're all trying to think about what does that mean for a public that now has to come to terms with itself for that. And the significance is that it reveals the interconnections of racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, and xenophobia. Together, the interconnections. That's what we have to figure out. It suggests that resisting racism and all forms of social injustice requires an intersectional analysis. And it highlights the significance of social class for anti-racism and similar social justice initiatives. Because the identity or the group that cross-cuts all of this, class cross-cuts all of this. All right, so here's what I see. I see anti-racist coalition politics and democratic possibilities. Building political coalitions among groups that are differentially targeted within white supremacy requires recognizing interdependent and intertwined struggles. Not telling one group to shut up, and not telling the other groups to everybody to just sit there and celebrate differences. We are beyond celebrating differences. That kind of multiculturalism, this is a very important historic moment. And it's a very important historic moment for youth. So I don't say this often, but we have to man up. Okay. I shouldn't have said that, I know. I take it back. I didn't say it. You can't unring the bell, I realize this, but I'm unringing it, all right? It's just kind of fun to play with you all, because you got up on Sunday morning. So how should we think about coalition politics that reflects the distinctive histories and angles of vision of these struggles? These are the kinds of questions we'll have to grapple with. I don't have answers, but I'm raising the questions that I think we have to grapple with in order to move forward to something bigger, to move forward to something that's democratic. So let me move to the third part of my talk and final part of my talk. These are all things I'm revisiting from the book, right, to be perfectly frank, kind of what I would say now, building on what I've already said. That's basically where I am. So now I'd like to move on to the third part and talk a little bit about critical thinking and media literacy. Now, when I wrote another kind of public education, I was really looking at one dimension of media. And this would be the top-down media. The fact that things had pretty much been set up so that to get information, to go to school, you had to be admitted. There were all these gatekeepers around getting access to knowledge and information. And that the media in that climate, in terms of television and film, was very much a top-down call the shots. And it still does to a certain extent. Something like hashtag #OscarSoWhite is really a response to that. But I think what has also happened is that people have moved from passive consumers of media, or maybe they weren't even passive at all, but they had no outlet to be active, to critical analysis and creators of media. So I think we're at a really interesting moment of what I would call, and I just decided to call it this morning, people's media. So what do you think about this? Corporate media and people's media. Does this make sense? Okay, you heard it here first. All right? When I was going through my talk, I said, that might work. I never know. I toy with things and just see what you say. But it kind of feels like that this kind of neoliberal corporate structure that we're in that always wants to profit. And you can certainly profit and do something that is valuable. It's not like profit is inherently awful. But people's media is very much a place where people are finding a voice, and they're breaking down this hierarchy, and they're saying things that they shouldn't be saying and thinking things they shouldn't be thinking. And perhaps I would just give a very different Flag Day speech because I was part of the people today, right? If I were 16, 17 years old today, things might feel very different to me. So building a democratic public sphere is what I think I want to talk about here, and sort of the significance of media. I want to focus on anti-racism because I've done an argument for race, but I could easily do a similar argument around gender and around ability and around sexuality. So I'm not doing that. I just want to let you know I am aware of these things. So if you want to raise your hand and say, why didn't you say, because I'm over time already, all right? How bad is it? Is it okay? Okay. I'm not even looking at them. I'm kind of looking over there to get, hey, come here. Because I know but I like you all. I want to keep going. All right. So, participatory democracy in people's media. This will go faster because it's a slide each. And I want to focus on what I would call the black public sphere, which used to be your neighborhood, your relatives, your church, people on your stoop, that kind of thing. But the black public sphere, when you really attach it to media, and how African Americans, particularly African American youth, are using media, and young people, teenagers, people in their 20s, into the 30s, and maybe even the 40s. All right, I'm learning from my students. I should say this. I taught I shouldn't say it yet. I'll tell you later. All right, but anyhow, so there are 5 things that I am learning from my students. I'm going to have to tell you. Sorry. I taught a course, an undergraduate course, with 3 graduate students and with undergrads at the University of Maryland on black social movements. And we studied this class. We did this class in real time. We started off studying Black Lives Matter in real time before it was a movement or thought of itself as a movement. So media was very central to how we actually frame things. So I ended up teaching a media course that I hadn't realized that's what I was teaching, because this is not my area of expertise. So thank you very much, graduate students who helped me with this. So a lot of what is here is what I'm learning from them. So I'm still a student here, just to let you know. But the first would be the creative use of corporate media, film and television. I think we have artists who have figured out a way to command the more general public sphere and get their art out there, film and television. I'll say that in a minute. The blogosphere, I think, is very interesting in terms of the kind of writing that people are doing in the blogosphere. And I call that from hierarchy, H-I-E-R-A-R-C-H-Y, yeah, to networks. Is that spelled right? It is, good. It sort of looks strange for a minute. All right, from hierarchy to networks. We're used to thinking hierarchically. I'm used to going to my teacher and saying, please sign off on my paper so I can say what I want to say, as opposed to, I'm going to say whatever I want to say, and I'm going to find the audience I want to talk to, and I'm going to figure out a way to get that out to a bigger audience. It's a very different way of thinking about the world. Gatekeeping is going away. Social media, Black Twitter and mediated activism. Witnessing smartphones and citizen journalism. This is the notion of technology. And finally, popular culture is text. All right, so let me just give you the examples, and I think that will get us to where we need to go. So these areas of people's media, the ways in which ordinary, everyday people are using media. The first would be visual media and the power of images. If you only have one movie to look at, then you argue about everything in that one movie. If you only have the Cosby Show to look at, remember the Cosby Show back before Cosby's fall from grace? All right, you argue about the Cosbys are not black enough or too black or they need better pictures on their wall. You know, you have a different kind of discourse. When you have media texts that are quite heterogeneous and that can have multiple conversations and people can enter them in multiple ways. I could fill a slide with all of the work that's being done by black artists where they are expressing a range of things. Again, I'm talking about the black public sphere, not necessarily the bigger one or maybe a Latino public sphere. I'm not doing that. This is illustrative, all right? So something like I Am Not Your Negro, how many of you saw that one? That's a way of look at that. This is a literate group. All right, this is a way of bringing Baldwin, who is being rediscovered by a whole generation of folk, and he's being rediscovered by visual images and by films and documentaries. We're in a period of time of kind of rewriting history, because history is never a finished story. It's always rewritten in the context of the issues we bring from today. So the fact that Baldwin went away and says, and he's looking at I Am Not Your Negro, very powerful film. On the right, we've got Ava DuVernay's 13th, and she's done a variety of things. But this is a documentary on Netflix that people can find and they can actually see. So you've got that. On the left, we've got The New Black, if you're not familiar with this one. Yoruba, her name is escaping me, a black woman filmmaker. So much I could say about all of these. But in the middle, I'm going to assume you're familiar with Moonlight. Basically, the surprise winner of the Oscar, when the entire crowd of La La Land, sadly, had to leave the stage, which was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. You know, it was almost like potentially a passing of the baton, but potentially not. We won't know until we see what else happens. But now a movie like Moonlight lets people know what's possible. That's what it says to the artist. You don't have to make Moonlight. You don't have to make anything like Moonlight. But this is possible. And I think that creates space for images, representations, arts. That's new text that we can read. We're thinking about reading just written text as opposed to media as text. So I think we're getting better texts, all right, at least in the media. The next area, the black blogosphere. I'm going pretty fast here. And then on the left, you see online intellectual communities that blur the boundaries among the academy, the arts, journalism, and public discourse as sites of public debate. I think there are a lot of people blogging who some of them are faculty members, some of them are not, some of them are in the academy, some of them are not. They are networking across these traditional boundaries that used to keep people separated. I'm an academic and you're not. I produce theory and you go do something with it. I'm the scholar, you're the activist. They're doing something different about with those boundaries. And I think the blogosphere is a very interesting place to see these things occur. One network that I would call your attention to is the Crunk Feminist Collective, which as far as I'm concerned has really gone and just excavated black feminism and has brought it to a whole generation of folk, not single-handedly, but they're really dedicated to it. And this is you can go on their webpage and find it. But another one that I was just introduced to 2 days ago was the blog of Very Smart Brothers. You heard of them? They're very cool. All right. And I didn't have time to get the slide in here, and I'm already talking too long, so I'm going to keep going. But I totally enjoyed them, just to let you know. Social media and mediated activism. The fact that the Black Lives Matter movement, very much the spark in some ways was a hashtag, right? So expressing something that really you care about, just with people, trying to find the people who care about those things you care about. And some of them may be your personal friends, but others may not be. They may be people you've never met or will never meet. Looking at how that movement has unfolded from not just an online activism, like we're going to speak out against, police brutality, but also through old-fashioned community organizing activism. And something we might call mediated activism, new ways of doing, and this is democratic participation for me, new ways of participating in the democratic process that are drawing upon the media as a tool that can be used in that way. This is not the only way that one can use hashtags, obviously, but I think we have powerful examples of how folk are creative in using the media in critical ways for critical literacy and for democratic participation. The next slide, witnessing smartphones and citizen journalism. This is Diamond Reynolds, who found herself unfortunately cast into the role of a citizen journalist as she filmed the killing of her boyfriend, Philando Castile, and while her daughter, Diana, who was 4, was in the back seat of the car. Now, any of you who've seen this is really the perfect storm of the use of the smartphone and hashtags, the use of the smartphone and Facebook, the use of the smartphone as a tool that people can carry. I don't know if she actually had a smartphone. I'm assuming it was. All right. I don't know if it was an iPhone, but many of them are. And recognizing that you're witnessing something, but you now have the tools to tell people about it. All right, there's now a public sphere that you can share it with immediately. And this, to me, was a very powerful example of the fusion of creating your own text, creating your own video. You're not called to do it, but in terms of African American traditions of witnessing and testifying, that's basically what she was doing. And she's saying, I'm not going to witness this by myself. And what you have with this particular example is the intergenerational nature of that. So her child is with her, witnessing and thinking and all of that that's going on. So I just think it's a very interesting period of time around these types of activities. This is democratic participation. All right, people will push to shut it down, but it is. And finally, popular culture is text. I thought I'd liven things up a little bit. Because, you know, I'm assuming you all, if you do not know who Beyonce is. Now, I'm not a Beyonce expert, but, you know, so if you don't know, that's okay. Ask somebody, you know, at lunch, who's Beyonce? Or get out your phone and like. But this particular notion of how to read popular culture as text, the entire thing, and how to really develop sophisticated skills of critical analysis of everything we have around us. I think many of my junior colleagues are leading the way in teaching courses that do this and are using media as central to those courses. So I had the benefit, I had the privilege of visiting with a young colleague of mine, Letitia Bates, who is teaching a course at the University of Cincinnati called Fierce Sociology. I said, okay, what is that? All right. Studying Beyonce. Her students spend the entire semester studying Beyonce, using Beyonce as a touchstone for a variety of issues, some of which I'll just mention a couple here because I found meeting with them very, very interesting in terms of the sophistication of analysis. The classroom was a wonderful place for them to bring their questions and their analysis. It wasn't a class where there's the Beyonce truth. Like there's the one speech on Beyonce, you just write it down. It was something different. So popular culture is text to refresh your memory. Here's Destiny's Child, Beyonce when she started off years ago. And here's the Super Bowl 2013, down in the corner. My point here is, and you see Beyonce at Super Bowl 13, which is a spectacle. I'm particularly interested in pop culture as spectacle and how you can disrupt spectacle as a site of public education. But here's Beyonce under surveillance. And in this particular graphic, we're surveilling Beyonce's butt. We're surveilling Beyonce's whatever. She's got that nice stance. Lacy. How can you have a lacy dominatrix outfit on in the Super Bowl? That's how it kind of looks to me. All right, but there she is. 3 years ago, this is Beyonce. Beyonce, reinterpreting history. You may not have seen Beyonce and her bananas, but the person on the left is Josephine Baker, who really understood how to use her body, had to go to France to do this. And she was treated as an exotic person, but she also had a very sophisticated understanding of the French, as did Baldwin, around these issues. So now is Beyonce just copying Josephine because she thought the bananas were cool? Or is she wearing the bananas because she's really making a statement of, I know you're always watching me, and I can appropriate these things and use them for my own purpose? We don't know. But these are the types of discussions that can occur in terms of media literacy and what we're seeing. Formation. Same song, same lyrics, very different ways of presenting that material visually. If you had the opportunity to see the Super Bowl in 2016, well, I don't even know what to say about this. Beyonce comes out with just sort of all the trappings of the Black Panthers, and they're marching in formation, and then the slide that I have, or the graphic that I have above to the right, is them doing those moves in those boots. Those sort of, I want you to put some boots on and try and do these moves. And you just see how hard this is. All right, so let us not underestimate the talent that's involved here. But that's not what I'm talking about right now. This is one way of taking the same image, taking the same music and taking the same lyrics and doing a very different visual. And this is interrupting the national pageantry of the Super Bowl. All right? We're going to walk right in the middle of the Super Bowl and say, hey, I own this stage because you invited me, and even though 3 years ago I was wearing lacy stuff and doing that, I'm going to do this year. We don't know whether this is just performance or art. We don't know. We don't know if it's sort of entertainment or art. And those are the types of questions that I think go along with media literacy. And here's the other frame. The students in the fierce sociology class just argued about this, because I happened to attend the day that they were discussing Formation, the video, and which is set in New Orleans. And what is she trying to do here? What are all the various ways that one could interpret this particular text? She gave them a visual text to discuss, but she gave it to them in conjunction with the Super Bowl formation. So I'm just presenting this to you as not just that it's obvious how you read these things, but what's important is that we get better skills of how to do it. So let me wrap up. Are you okay out there? Yes. All right, let me wrap up. I have no idea. I have no clock up here. This is totally irresponsible on my part. I understand. All right, I will send you presents and gifts because I was irresponsible. I really do understand. But anyhow, just to wrap up the media. Media contains heterogeneous ideas that you can do many things with. Hopefully that came for you. It's no longer rationed. It's no longer one guy at CBS saying, here's what you're going to watch, here's what you're going to think. All right? Media provides a public sphere for practicing democratic participation, social media conversations, and many of the things that I talked about. Technology empowers individuals as critics and producers of ideas. And I gave you the example of smartphones in terms of how they empower us. And what kind of democratic possibilities can we create with these tools? Is what we're left with. So to recap and finish, this is what I had earlier. These were my main ideas. Building vibrant, inclusive public institutions involves practicing participation, understanding how social inequalities undermine participatory democracy, recognizing multiple sites where participatory democracy occurs. These are the three main ideas that I've been grappling with today. And I could stop here. Do you want to know how things turned out? Should I tell you? Or not? I could read, but I'm just going to tell you and wrap up. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. And the reason I remember it is because I couldn't do it. And I had to ask myself, why can't I do this? This would be so easy. All you have to do is get up there and read. I know how to read. I know how to read other people's stuff. That's what school was all about. So I had to tell my English teacher, I said, I'm really sorry. I can't make these corrections that you want me to make, and I can't do it. My English teacher said, okay. She didn't say, really? What do you mean by that? That's the teacher we all want to be, all right? She just said, fine. She replaced me with another black girl. And 2 days later, when the ceremony occurred, in the newspaper, I saw a picture of the ceremony, and I saw the people on the dais, and they were all white, except for this one little black girl, and she had her, what does the flag mean to me, Flag Day speech. But they didn't tell us what was in her speech. So it didn't matter what her speech was. It mattered that she looked a certain way, and there she was. So we have to be very, very careful about all of these dynamics to think about what does it mean to really take a stand for democratic participation and for participatory democracy. Because I think what education does is ground zero for all of it. So thank you so much for inviting me.
That was outstanding. And so thought-provoking, powerful. We have, just to kind of move it along, we have three folks who will provide commentaries, a little bit in relationship to the talk, a little bit in what they're thinking already. And we're delighted to have Professor Anthony Brown, who is an associate professor of curriculum and instruction at the University of Texas at Austin. Did you drive up? Oh, I'm impressed. Okay, and Kimberly Scott, who is an associate professor of women and gender studies and executive director of the Arizona State University's Center for Gender Equity in Science and Technology, and Joseph Simpian, who is associate professor of economics and education policy at the Steinhardt School of Education at New York University. So, we may run over a little, so stay with us, okay?
Because we're over time, I'll be brief. But I think I enter this conversation thinking about some of the things Dr. Hill Collins noted. The notion of historical advocacy, I think, would be fitting to some of the work that I've done on black males. Specifically, the ideas that certain stories or myths that have been told about black males. So in order to understand like very present issues related to black males, there needs to be a very specific interrogation of race over time. And that's what my work has tried to be committed to over the years. But before I do that, I'm going to quickly share two data points in the present that are pertinent to like these ongoing issues. 2016, Yale University released a study where they interviewed 300, they didn't interview, they had recruited 300 early childhood educators from a conference to look at a video. And in the video, there was a black girl, a black boy, a white girl, and a white boy. They asked them every time, when you look at this video, we're going to give you a clicker. And every time you see a challenging behavior in the classroom, you'll click the clicker. They also had an innovative technology that allowed you to look, they could gauge how long you gazed at a certain side of the video. So how long you gaze at particular students in that video. Well, from we know historically, we know who won that race. Black boys were gazed at far more longer than other children in the room. And the clicker clicked. They got the most clicks and observations in that room. Now here's the catch of the study. There are no challenging behaviors in the video. So the point of it is that there's these deep-seated implicit biases that are there even when they're not there. So there are no challenging behaviors, but we find them. And the second one is a study that social psychologists have been doing for decades. They've been able to find that there's these direct correlations. If you show a picture of a black man, people begin to associate it with every negative crime, guns, things that are immediately associated. They've found this data consistent for a number of years. But scholars such as Jennifer Eberhardt and a bunch of her colleagues at Stanford, Goff, have found that there's now bidirectional bias, where I could give you the symbol of a gun and immediately will be associated with black men. Take it even deeper. They recently did a study and says, what happens when we look at these issues of bias as they relate to young children? 5-year-old black faces, same biases, same issues of threat and aggression. So what my work tries to do is try and deconstruct that as a historical phenomena rather than something that exists in the present. So here I'll just lay out about, it's a lot of years of history, but I'm going to do it in about 2 minutes. 1500s, English travelers document the so-called bestial and libidinous nature of African American males. They're documented, become the kind of first anthropological studies of black men. 1700s to 1800s, scientists dissect every aspect of the black male body, even placing black male penises in natural science museums. 1800s to 1900s, theologians get engaged in the conversation and argue that black men are beasts, and not just nomenclature like they are a beast, but from a theological standpoint they are a beast. Now the argument was this, that when God asked Noah, first he says, black people cannot be the descendants of Ham, some theologians. This is a 400-page, very well known, Negro is beast, 1900, right after Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction. The nadir, as some refer to it. Now this was a time where there was arguments as to what we're going to do with this Negro and what we can do to sustain them. So this was the theological and scientific advancement. Now the theological argument was this. If Noah is he says he can't be a descendant of Ham. The Negro cannot be. So it's not the curse of Ham. I guess that's a good thing, because that was the defense of slavery for centuries. But now we're arguing that Noah and his descendants were all white. So when God said, "Come on the ark," you might be wondering, well, how did the Negro survive the flood? Well, God commanded the beast to come on the ark as well. These were very prominent arguments. 1900s, 1930s, the 1950s. The black male is absent from sociological studies. He's absent from the home. He's absent from his responsibilities. And it's a recycled kind of pathology, a dysfunction. 1960s, he's castrated and emasculated. 1970s, he's culturally adaptive. 1990s, he's endangered in crisis. 2015, threat and aggression. We see the constant continuum of these ideas. So that's my contribution to this conversation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Hopefully you can hear me. So I want to pick up on three salient points that Dr. Collins said and put it in tension with the work that I am currently doing along with a coalition of other African American computer scientists and social scientists around the issues of digital equity for girls of color in this digital age. I wholeheartedly agree with what I call my scholarly foremother, that if we don't have skills to educate for the democratic participation, we won't have democratic participation. Because I think the same can be said about educating girls of color for this digital age. Presently, the vast majority of our efforts, supported by an incredible amount of money, simply are manifesting or supporting uncritical reproduction of technical skills. So in 2016, my president, I call him, President Obama announced the Computer Science Education for All initiative, and that made sense. And then very soon afterwards, there's about $135 million that various federal agencies were charged to disseminate for broadening participation in computer science in particular, but STEM writ large. And so last year, about $20 million was put forth. And so the logical argument, at least in my mind, was, well, then that should move the needle. We should see more girls and women of color going into computer science and technology, the fastest growing of STEM careers. But just a few days ago, literally a few days ago, Tech Lever's report was released, and it demonstrated how few tech companies, particularly the top three, are able to recruit and retain women of color. The numbers have stayed between 3 to 5%. And then the 2017 NSF report illustrated that not only has there been a decrease with African American women acquiring their bachelor's degree in computer science, the decrease is felt more by us in the past few years than any other racial group. So it leads me to wonder, well, what's the money going towards? And that is why when Dr. Collins said we lack language to appropriately analyze contemporary racism, I think that we also lack language to appropriately analyze the contemporary issues of digital equity as it relates for women of color. And in the lack of having language, I argue that this is positioning us as women of color to become the digital maids of the 21st century. And then if we can use intersectionality as a critical framework and a critical praxis, which she argues in her most recent book on intersectionality, we may be able to redefine our program development efforts as well as our research. More specifically, we must begin to problematize the pipeline. Just using the pipeline by itself, I think, is very problematic. But in her book, she says how oftentimes the neoliberal argument is about leveling playing fields. And we use the pipeline as saying, well, if we can only get more girls of color into that pipeline, then competition will be fair. Well, we need just simply look at the multitude of reports, my own work included, about what happens when you get in the pipeline doesn't mean you have the power to remain. If we focus merely on getting my brown and black daughters' bodies into the pipeline, It causes us to forget the lack of power that we may wield. The fact that if we look at for-profit colleges, and this was accorded by a Bob and Brown study, that the for-profit colleges are providing more people of color, particularly African Americans and Latina, opportunities to get low-level tech skills, and that they are not necessarily, we're not getting the, what I call the power skills to even acquire the jobs to enter the supposed pipeline by the top 3 companies. It's no wonder that these percentages remain the same. And then we look at the research informing our efforts as to why we and what we should be doing to change the pipeline. We are lacking understanding of what Christy Dotson calls the epistemic oppression. We must understand the limits of the epistemological framework to adequately address persistent epistemic exclusions. More specifically, how often do we see the efforts that are supposedly for women of color, including our voices, in which we are narrating and co-authoring what those efforts should look like? So I agree with Dr. Collins, of course, is that it's completely possible to not only change the numbers and change our thinking and change our education to be more democratic, and so that we can provide our daughters opportunity to do far more than simply write their own codes, because I think that simply writing your own code is simply acquiring cues to defray the guilt of certain individuals. It should not concern, meaning that our efforts and our research should not simply concern about how many individuals we place into a position to destain the guilt of exclusion in the hostile environment, but for how well we teach our daughters to own the digital stage, just as Dr. Collins says, Beyonce owned Super Bowl stage. And I'll end there.
Hi, everyone. So I knew I was going to have to follow Dr. Collins and 2 excellent reactors, but I didn't know Beyonce was going to pop in there too, and I'd have to follow that. So thank you. Yeah, so my area is economics and education policy. So I felt a little bit like, maybe it's a little bit outside my wheelhouse. Of course, I was like, thank you. I'm so humbled to be part of this. Yeah, no, it really wasn't. But I also wanted to have something so that I didn't waste your time. So I wanted to have something that I thought, well, I can contribute something here. But I study, part of what I study are issues in gender stereotypes and how there's particular biases and how that could affect achievement. And it's largely in math that I'm going to talk about. Then there's a little bit more that I'll mention too. So some work that I did was looking at the early childhood longitudinal study. It's the kindergarten class of 1998, 1999, and looking to see the extent to which teachers had different expectations of their male and female students if we could identify boys and girls who were achieving identically by an outside test and what the outside test was saying, and then also that the teacher rated to be equally engaged with the material and equally well behaved in everything. And we looked at these kind of matched kids within the same classroom. So it wasn't like they had different teachers that were doing the rating too. And what we found, there's a lot up there, don't worry about it. This is with data that were started to be collected in 1998-99. And what we see down here is it's suggesting, the parents are suggesting that as early as first grade, teachers are underestimating the mathematical abilities of girls relative to equally achieving, behaving, and engaged boys in the same classrooms, also conditioning on race and SES and all sorts of features. And what this is showing you, I mean, it's a weird kind of representation if you don't have the context of the entire paper, but we're looking at the gap throughout the achievement distribution. So this is happening among low-achieving students, among middle-achieving students, and high-achieving students. So it's consistently this underestimating of girls' mathematical ability. So that was data from 98-99, and then 12 years later, the National Center for Education Statistics collected another cohort of data, right? So they started with kids in kindergarten. And what do we see? We see exactly the same pattern, where we have millennials entering the workforce. We have a new, like, you would think that things would change a bit. They're not. The teachers are still underestimating girls in math, and this is happening as early as first grade. We checked to see if there were any sort of statistically significant differences between the two different cohorts. Nothing. And then I think it's just kind of interesting. These are actually female teachers who are doing the underrating of female students. And so I was thinking, like, that's kind of how ingrained the sexism and racism is that we have, and it's playing out in schools, and very early in elementary school too. And then you might ask, well, does this have any sort of effect on achievement? And so we have these econometric models where we're trying to estimate the causal effect of this underestimating girls' ability, and we reached this conclusion that it's a pretty resounding yes, it does affect the achievement gap, and in fact, our analysis suggested it accounts for about 50% of the growth in the math gender achievement gap. So if we weren't underestimating girls' abilities, that gap would grow by about half as much. Here's a little anecdote that I want to share. So we did this work and we were kind of surprised. Not, to some extent you're not surprised, and in other ways you are kind of surprised, right? So then we got teachers together and thought, well, how can we create an intervention? And so we were trying to explain our work to the teachers. And this was when I was back in Illinois. And a third grade teacher said, look, I don't understand why you're studying gender gaps in math. Look, and she brought her state test scores, and she said, I brought my state test scores, and the boys and girls are scoring the same. See? The girls can score just as well as the boys if they try hard enough. Yeah, right. Yeah, that was how we all thought, right? And we're like, But then, like this kind of little miracle happened. She had like this brief moment. No one said anything. Nothing happened. And then she goes, oh my gosh, I just did exactly what you said teachers do. I had no idea. Now I get why you're studying this, right? We changed one mind, so great. We need to scale that up a bit. But yeah, I mean, it just points to how we, these attributions that we make that we don't even recognize that we make, and what we think it takes for an individual of a particular sex or gender, or an individual of a particular race to succeed, and we think that those things are different. And some people are just innately gifted and others aren't. So that's a Bitmoji of my husband. So that's he's also a professor at NYU in psychology, and that's me, just to show that we're two different people. So.
Wait a minute.
Yeah, aren't we so? No, it's different. So anyway, and he has some work where he's looking at the. So you might be familiar with Carol Dweck's mindset work and growth mindsets and fixed mindsets, and some of the work that Andre did is saying, well, we can scale that up, not just the level of the individual, but like institutions can have these mindsets too. So and then he looked in academic disciplines, he and his colleagues did, and what they did is they sent surveys to a whole bunch of professors to see how much do you think you have to be innately gifted to succeed in this academic discipline? And what they found was pretty shocking. So we can be proud of education, I guess. We're over here. We think you can work hard and succeed, right? And then further to the right, those are the academic disciplines that think you have to be brilliant and in order to, you just have to have it, right? You either have it or you don't. And so what you see is there's a very strong relationship between the percent of women who are PhD earners and the extent to which an academic discipline thinks you need to be brilliant in order to succeed. So that's not just for women. You also see a very similar pattern for African American participation too. You don't see it for Asian American participation, but it kind of makes sense why you see it and you don't see it in certain cases. So really, it's kind of this combination of the beliefs that the academics have, like you just have to have or you don't have to have it, combined with cultural stereotypes that we have about which groups are likely to be gifted and smart just innately, right? And those two things combine, and that's at least one of the features that contributes to academic achievement gaps. That was looking at higher education. Recently, they looked at this kind of phenomenon about who boys and girls who are 5 years, 6 years, and 7 years old think are really, really smart. At 5, you don't see differences, but at 6, the girls start, like everyone picks their own gender. They're like, oh, I'm really, like my people are really, really smart, right? But by 6, that's when you see the girls start to think, maybe the girls aren't really, really smart. It's the boys who are really, really smart. So it's happening at very young ages. this is a really quick recap. It leaves me just questioning, like, what now? So we have, how do we change these attitudes when we know that teachers hold these stereotypes, and some of them don't even know that they hold these stereotypes, and we see this happening in old cohorts and in new cohorts of teachers, and then professors hold these stereotypes too that are also causing the suppression of participation. And when we think about it, we like to think, relatively speaking, these are fairly equity-oriented people who are holding these beliefs. And now we have to think, well, there are others who are not so equity-oriented, who feel emboldened, and then I just think, I hate to end on such a depressing note, but like, what do we do to change this? Anyway, I'll end there. Thanks. All right. I'll end on depressing.
Well, there was rhyme and reason and in my thinking about who was going to be on the stage and the different perspectives. And so thank you. That was really terrific. We want to just open it up we have about 5 or 6 minutes for questions or commentaries and response. Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I actually admire your work quite greatly. My name is Peter Kim with the University of Pennsylvania Center for the Study of Race and Equity in Education. A history of structural inequities in America would label someone like me Asian American. But I'm not Asian American. I'm Cambodian. We actually have some of the highest dropout and poverty rates in this country. But the reality is that 15 years of research on the Asian American community has led me to argue quite confidently that scholars, whites and non-whites, view Asian Americans in a way that is focused on achievement. And then you create this sense of racial pitting, which my work seeks to debunk. So my question is, as we're working towards this sense of what you call anti-racist coalition politics, how can we do that in a way that is inclusive of Asian Americans when the reality is that the way in which we see Asian Americans is grounded in so much racism?
Open it up to the panel, I think.
Well, that's exactly my point, is that rather than trying to everyone thinking about being inclusive, I think inclusive on one hand is obviously a noble goal. But I think 15 years of research on Asian Americans, Cambodians is really what we need. And I don't particularly care who does it, whether it's Asian Americans who do it or Cambodians who do it or Vietnamese. We get the texture if that research is grounded in those particular histories. And what I think will come out of that will be an identification of the points of overlap, the points of convergence, and the points of divergence. So we'll have a much more grounded general agenda, because we'll see those points that come from the research itself in this particular example, as opposed to imagining what those points of contact might be and using our own experiences as the only point of reference. So I'm thinking about something a little different than how you get to the universal through multiple particulars. You don't stop at the particular, you don't start at the universal and scale down. You work very differently in terms of being historically grounded. Now, that's how I would envision you get a really strong coalition, because you've hammered it out in some sorts. You would see that there, in fact, are. It annoys me when I hear that these ideas are as powerful and deeply entrenched as they tend to turn out to be. I mean, I've been coming to conferences for decades now. And we tend to hear these same things. So it's really, and they're important to do, but at some point we have to say we need a different way of working with this information, both intellectually and politically, so that we're not just going down the same path assuming that more evidence will in fact lead to a different outcome. Because I don't think it will. I think it's really, this last presentation is saying we've got a lot of evidence here, and here's a new cohort of millennials, and maybe we can't go for wishful thinking on this. So I think your example's very well taken around one of the many points where one would start. And for me, I am interested in seeing those various historically constructed real communities. We're not making them up in the academy because we want to study pregnant teens. Therefore, we create a category called pregnant teens. And then we imagine things about pregnant teens. We look at historically constructed groups who have histories and who also have something at stake in this. And think about how those people could be involved in coalition. But that's something we have to do. It's not going to come from above. It's really going to have to come from, quote, below. So that's really how I would respond to that in terms of the spirit of it. Details, I don't know. That's you.
Anybody else? Yes.
Thank you so much, Vicki Mokuria, doctoral student, Texas A&M. And I want to ask about the alt-right. And one day, leaving A&M, driving to Austin, I see all these military trucks. I'm like, there's not a base around here. And a strange-looking flag, like a black and white American flag. And then I researched and found out that the alt-right are actually, this was the day when A&M was doing a huge service project. Every neighborhood was, painting and gardening for the elderly, that kind of thing.
For the elderly.
And meanwhile, the alt-right are militarizing themselves.
I understand.
And we're all clueless. And I really want to know, in addition to writing and theorizing, how to address this cancerous, really, they are militarizing themselves. And how do we address the alt-right?
I guess my point is I had a student who I thought was being alarmist because for years he was saying, Dr. Collins, you need to hear about this. You need to read about these people. And I just thought, right, French. And of course, I don't feel that way anymore. So, I think I would give a similar answer. It's not a question of there's one overarching program. It's really a notion of this would be the geographic locale as opposed to the intellectual locale, version of it. So I don't know what it will take going from, in terms of the specifics of where you are, but I think we now have better tools to think about it. We have a lot of evidence, we have a lot of ideas, we have conceptual tools, we have media, we have things we can use to organize differently, but you really have to have a focus of what you want to see as an outcome. Right? I'm a believer in what is the goal and what are we moving toward. And you don't ever, some of the goals that I've had in my life I'll never see the end of, but I know I've moved toward them. I can see the difference. So in terms of what to do about these people, one thing I would say is this. There's a movie called Hate Rising. What's his first name? Jorge Ramos? Am I close? But this particular film gives you the whole notion that the alt-right is exactly how you've described them. Sort of fringy type people, militaristic, walking around parading with guns and flags. Okay, that might be. But the truly scary person in that film for me was an upper middle class white man who he interviewed, who was saying very similar things, but it was completely plausible the way he said it. So I don't dismiss ideas as being just theoretical. I really think that there are many places where people can think about how they want to grapple with these issues, and some of them will be organizationally on the ground, specific local communities, but others will be in some of those fields that are considered off limits to us. Like philosophy, the fact that you use Christy Dotson in philosophy, I think is a really good example of it in terms of black women in philosophy. So I'm really encouraged by what I'm seeing in terms of our ability to impact various disciplines, to ask different questions. And one of the reasons I started with my story was to not back down. We cannot back down. Sometimes you have to be quiet because that's for reasons of your own professional advancement. You just remember, and then you say someday, but you don't forget, or it's dangerous or whatever. But without that whole notion of there are lots of people behind us who really are counting on us to exert some kind of intellectual leadership. And that's our responsibility because we have the degrees and we have the English and we have the computers and we have all kinds of things we can use. So to self-define ourselves the way others want to define us as either victims or downtrodden or whatever is ceding territory to folk. And they, in fact, win when we do that. But the issue is to not get arrogant. Right?
Sure. Oh, where? Oh, I'm sorry. There, I'm sorry.
Hi there. My name is Beth Lynn. I'm director of the Education Justice Network, and I've been increasingly interested in the processes that allow us to interrupt these cycles of marginalization and allow marginalized people to kind of reassert their voices in the democratic process. And I wondered, what are some of the most powerful, radical democratic processes that you've seen? And I'm thinking about maybe things like participatory budgeting or things like hackathons in the coding context that allow marginalized people to speak up and problem solve together and then reassert their voices in the democratic context.
Anybody want to speak to that down there?
I'll start off on a negative note, just because I'm hungry. So, one of the things that I'm considerably mindful of these one-day events, these hackathons, and this preponderance on just the technical. I mean, let's be blunt. The people who are leading the most innovative companies, they're not just coding. And they're not just graduating, for those who do go to the higher ed, from the for-profit institutions, right? And so I'm troubled. I'm very, very worried. And to the point that's already been said, there's not enough research yet on the impact of these hackathons on a global level, and there's certainly not enough that uses an intersectional analysis. At best, they'll say, we're going to do this for women, or we're going to do this for people of color. Well, what about me? Aren't I both a woman and a person of color? So I encourage all of us as researchers, to the point that Dr. Collins said earlier, is that we need to pay incredible attention to the impact, and not just and the impact along various lines of intersection, and not just can you code. That should not be a barometer of success if you can write a line of code. It's more about what can you do with that. And for my purposes, what can you do with that to also advance your community? Again, the point of success in the digital age is often how quickly and how far you can run away from your community and go to the Apples and the Googles and the Microsofts and do very little except to contribute to, as Dr. Collins just said, seeding the hate with negative stories of technological deficiency, right? So, but on a positive note, I think that there's small but powerful growing forces of more interdisciplinary work, not necessarily in education alone or computer science alone or in engineering alone. And some of the federal agencies are beginning to fund the interdisciplinary work in I think, creative ways. But even before that, there's now more funding for having to have the conversation about what that interdisciplinary work even looks like, because that's not even, that's not even happening. So I don't have a good answer, but just more a problematic one.
Could I say one thing? I think what I would say is that I think we need to think more broadly about what radical means. All right, radical doesn't necessarily just mean disruption. All right, or disruption doesn't necessarily mean incident. A lot of students think of it that way. There's the big thing, we're going to go disrupt it, and therefore we'll see where to go next. It really may be, to me, some of the most radical stuff you never saw coming. All of a sudden, things were different the following week than they were the previous week, and nobody knows what happened. That's radical, too. All right, but that's a very different way of thinking about change. Do you want to be a front stage actor, a backstage actor? Is this going to be a parallel organizational process? And I happen to think a lot of lasting change occurs by people who really had a vision, who were quite radical, who were sometimes, and they sent certain people to disrupt certain things as a tactic, but that isn't necessarily the strategy. Now, the issue is people want to feel good about their contributions. So there's something very heroic about getting in somebody's face and confronting them and all of that. It's much less exciting to have to get up every day and do the work of creating the conditions for somebody who gets to take that particular position. But they're all required. So on the one hand, you can't just say, I'm going to disrupt you, and if you don't know how to code, and then you're in there saying, you people are racist or sexist or whatever. You have to be prepared. That's a whole other part of this whole notion of sort of a critical education for this. So I like this word radical, but it's more a visionary term for me. It's not like it's embedded in any particular ideology. I don't necessarily think, ideologies of anti-capitalism are radical. I mean, I think it's not embedded in any one ideology, nor in any particular set of behaviors. It's really contextual, and it really is a notion of what you're trying to do, the context that we're in. So what would be radical action for this example in Texas, and what would be just conservative action, or what would be just status quo action, or what is sort of, how are you complicit, or how are you not? It's another way of asking it. So, outside the box. I like getting out the box. So I just want to say that so we don't end on this sort of gloomy.
No, we're not. There's a theme that informed this conference this year, and it clearly ran through this discussion, and that is there's an enormous amount of work to do. And we can't be faint of heart, and we need to be deliberate and thoughtful. And I think the panel, Patricia and the panel, all the panelists have actually spoken to that. And so I hope that you leave this session with the idea that you must contribute to the discourse in meaningful ways, both in conceptualizing it and moving it forward. So if you want to be able to come up and talk afterwards, but we need to end this session. And I want to thank Professor Hill Collins and these wonderful speakers here. Thank you as well for coming.